Roderick Blackthorn didn't knock. He shoved the door of Silas Hartwell's freight office open so hard the glass rattled in its frame, and every man in the room flinched except Silas, who's too old and too tired to flinch at anything anymore. Roderick dropped a leather folder onto the old man's desk. Papers scattered. An inkwell tipped and bled black across 3 months of careful ledger work. "You have 30 days, Roderick said. His voice wasn't loud. That was the worst part. 30 days, Silas. After that, I take the yard, the horses, the wagons, and whatever dignity you've got left." Silas looked at the papers. His hands were shaking, and he didn't try to hide it. "Roderick, 30 days. He walked out without closing the door. If you've ever watched someone you love get humiliated by a man who could afford to be patient about it, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story to the end, because what happens next in this valley is something none of them saw coming. Hit the like button, leave a comment with the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really started. The morning Evelyn Hartwell rode 40 miles across the Wyoming frontier to beg a rich man for mercy, she told herself she wasn't ashamed. She lied. She was ashamed every mile of it. Ashamed of the borrowed dress she'd pressed 3 times to make it look less borrowed. Ashamed of the way she'd practiced what to say in her head the whole ride, trying out different words like a woman trying on hats she knew she couldn't afford. Ashamed that her father, a man who'd spent 30 years building something honest out of Wyoming dirt, couldn't bring himself to make this trip in person. But Silas Hartwell hadn't slept in 2 weeks. She'd heard him walking the floorboards at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, wearing channels into the wood above her bedroom. He was 61 years old, and the debt had taken something out of him that sleep wasn't giving back. So Evelyn got up before dawn, put on the pressed dress, told her father she was going to the market in Clearwater, and rode 40 miles west toward Blackthorn Ranch. She didn't tell him where she was really going. He would have stopped her, and then he would have gone himself, and she wasn't sure he would have survived the humiliation of it. The ranch appeared over a long rise of hill, and Evelyn pulled her horse to a stop without meaning to. She'd heard people describe Blackthorn Ranch, of course. Everyone in the valley had something to say about it: the size of the main house, the number of cattle, the fact that Roderick Blackthorn ran the whole operation with a skeleton crew, because he paid them well enough that none of them ever quit. But descriptions and the actual thing were different animals entirely. The main house was 3 stories of dark timber and river stone, and it sat at the center of the operation like something that had grown there instead of being built. Outbuildings spread in every direction: barns, equipment sheds, a bunkhouse with smoke already rising from its chimney despite the early hour. She could see cattle moving in the distance, a dark mass, shifting slowly against the pale autumn grass. There were horses in a corral near the barn, and one of them was giving a cowhand considerable trouble, spinning and throwing his head and refusing to be saddled. Evelyn watched the horse for a moment. She understood that horse completely. She rode down to the house. A cowhand met her before she reached the front steps, a young man with sun-cracked lips and the cautious eyes of someone trained to be polite to strangers while quietly figuring out whether they were trouble. "Ma'am," he said, "help you with something?" "I'm looking for Mr. Blackthorn." "I'm Evelyn Hartwell, Silas Hartwell's daughter." Something shifted in the cowhand's expression. Just barely. Just enough for Evelyn to catch it, and she felt her stomach drop a little, because she knew what that expression meant. It meant he recognized the name, and not for good reasons. "I'll let him know you're here," the cowhand said. "You want to wait on the porch?" "I'll stand," Evelyn said, because sitting felt too much like waiting to be called into a schoolmaster's office. She stood by her horse and looked out over the operation, and tried to slow her breathing down to something that resembled normal. The difficult horse in the corral had given up fighting the cowhand and was now standing with its head low, ears flat, the particular posture of an animal that had decided to be angry quietly. Evelyn watched it and thought that was probably the most sensible approach to a great number of situations. Miss Hartwell. She turned. Roderick Blackthorn was younger than she'd expected. She'd built a picture of him in her head from the stories. A large, hard-edged older man, the kind who'd inherited everything and never forgotten it. The real man was somewhere in his late 30s, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been outside in Wyoming weather for a long time. He was handsome in the way that certain landscapes were handsome, not pretty, not soft, but built for exactly the conditions it occupied. He was also looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Mr. Blackthorn," she said, "I appreciate you seeing me." "I didn't know you were coming," he said. "Is your father with you?" "No. I came alone." A brief pause. "Why? He isn't well." She said it simply because she didn't have the energy for anything more elaborate, and someone needed to come. Roderick studied her for a moment, not the way men sometimes looked at her, scanning her face and then dropping lower, making their assessment the way you'd look over a horse at auction. He was watching her in a different way, trying to figure something out. "Come inside," he said. She followed him through the front door, into a house that immediately surprised her. She'd expected something cold, all that money, all that space, the kind of home that was more statement than shelter. Instead, it was plain, functional. The furniture was good quality, but worn in the way that furniture gets when people actually use it rather than display it. There was a coat hanging crookedly from a peg by the door, and a pair of small, muddy boots beside it. Children's boots. She almost said something about the boots, then stopped herself. She wasn't here to notice things. She was here to ask for time. Roderick led her into a front room with a fireplace already burning and gestured toward a chair across from his desk. She sat. He remained standing, which she suspected was deliberate, but she didn't let it bother her. Let him stand. "I know why you're here," he said. "Then I'll skip the preamble. My father owes you $4,000. He can't pay it by the end of the month. He needs more time." "How much time?" 6 months would allow him to get through the winter freight contracts and... No, the word landed flat and final. Evelyn held it for a moment before responding. "No to 6 months or no to any extension?" "No to 6 months. What he needs is a different arrangement." She looked at him carefully. "What kind of arrangement?" He didn't answer immediately. He went to the window and looked out toward the barn, and for a moment, Evelyn had the strange sense that he was as uncomfortable as she was, which didn't fit the version of him she'd constructed in her head. "Your father's debts didn't start with me," Roderick said finally. "He came to me 3 years ago when he was already in trouble. I agreed to consolidate what he owed because I knew his work, and I respected him. But the situation's only gotten worse. I know that. He's not going to be able to pay this back, Miss Hartwell. Not in 6 months, not in 12. You know that too, or you wouldn't be here." The blunt truth of it hit her harder than she'd expected. She'd known it, of course had known it, the way you know things you won't let yourself look at directly. Hearing it said out loud by a stranger in a firelit room was a different experience than knowing it abstractly. "What are you proposing?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Roderick turned from the window. He looked at her with that unreadable expression again, and then he said something that knocked the floor right out from under her. "I'm proposing that you consider marrying me." The silence lasted a long time. "I beg your pardon," Evelyn said. "I have a 9-year-old niece in my care, Maisie. Her parents died 2 winters ago in the fever outbreak west of the Sweetwater. She's been living here since then, and He stopped, cleared his throat. "I'm not equipped to raise a child. I know ranching, I know cattle and land and contracts. I do not know what a 9-year-old girl needs, and every day I am aware that I'm failing her." Evelyn stared at him. "And you think a stranger solves that?" "I think a wife provides stability that I cannot provide alone. Mr. Blackthorn, if you agree, your father's debt disappears. All of it. The freight yard stays in his name. He keeps everything." He paused. "And I would expect nothing from you that you're not willing to give. That is my word, and I do not say things I don't mean." Evelyn sat very still. She was aware of about 14 different things happening inside her chest. At the same moment, fury, disbelief, a strange sort of desperate calculation that she hated herself for, and something else beneath all of it that she couldn't quite name. "I'm a widow," she said at last. "I know, I'm 30 years old. I know that too. And you want to purchase a wife to manage your household and look after your niece, and you're framing it as charity toward my father." Something flickered across his face. "I'm not framing it as charity. I'm offering an arrangement that serves both parties. My niece needs a woman in her life who is consistent, capable, and present. You need your father's debts erased. That's not charity. That's a transaction." "A transaction," Evelyn repeated. "A contract, if you prefer that word." She stood up. She needed to be standing for this part. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning," she said. "I need to see the rest of this place first." He blinked. Clearly, he'd expected either acceptance or rejection, not a counter. "What do you need to see?" he asked. "Everything," Evelyn said. But first those graves on the hill. She'd seen them riding in. 2 headstones on a small rise behind the main house, visible from the road. Something about them had caught her eye, and something about the way Roderick's face changed when she mentioned them. Now told her they mattered more than anything else she could have named. "Those are private," he said. "You're asking me to live in this house," Evelyn said. "For the rest of my life, presumably. Those stones are not going to be private to me forever." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then quietly, "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll take you up there myself." That night, Roderick Blackthorn did something he almost never did. He told his housekeeper, a stout, sharp-eyed woman named Agnes, to set an extra place for dinner. Agnes looked at the extra plate, looked at Evelyn, looked at Roderick, and said nothing, which was Agnes's loudest form of communication. Maisie came downstairs for dinner in a dress that was clean but had been buttoned crookedly, 2 buttons off from the top, so the whole thing pulled slightly sideways. Nobody had fixed it. Evelyn noticed it the way she noticed most things quietly, filing it away without expression. Girl was small for 9, with dark hair pulled into braids that had clearly started the day neat and progressively lost that battle. She had Roderick's coloring dark eyes, strong features but something softer in the face, something that suggested the woman she would eventually become was already planning its arrival. Maisie stopped in the doorway when she saw Evelyn. "Who's that?" she asked Roderick. Not rudely, just directly, the way children ask things when they haven't yet learned to be subtle about it. "A guest," Roderick said. "Miss Hartwell. She's staying tonight." Maisie looked at Evelyn with the particular scrutiny of a child who has learned to be cautious about adults she doesn't know yet. "Are you from around here?" "About 40 miles east," Evelyn said. "Clearwater direction. I've been to Clearwater. There's a bakery there. They have the good rolls." "They do. The ones with the seeds on top." Maisie appeared to find this an acceptable credential. She came to the table and sat down, and Evelyn reached over and quietly rebuttoned the top of her dress without making a comment about it. Maisie looked down at what she'd done, looked up at Evelyn, and didn't say anything either. Roderick watched the whole exchange over the rim of his coffee cup. Dinner was a quiet affair. Agnes had made a beef stew that was better than any meal Evelyn had eaten in the past 6 months, and she was embarrassingly aware of how good it tasted. She ate carefully and listened, while Maisie talked about a horse named Copper that she apparently considered her personal property, even though Roderick looked pained every time she said his name. "He throws everyone," Maisie said, "but he doesn't throw me." "He threw you last Tuesday," Roderick said. "That was different. I startled him." "You were on his back." "I startled him from his back," Maisie clarified, as if this were an important distinction. "It wasn't his fault." Evelyn pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. Maisie caught it anyway, and something warm moved through the girl's face. "Do you ride?" Maisie asked. "I do. Not as well as you, probably." "I could teach you, Maisie," Roderick said mildly. "I'm just saying I could." She looked at her stew. "If she stays long enough." The words dropped into the quiet and sat there. Nobody addressed them directly. Evelyn picked up her spoon and continued eating, and across the table Roderick Blackthorn looked at his niece with an expression so complicated that Evelyn couldn't begin to disassemble it. After dinner, while Agnes cleared the table and Maisie was sent upstairs to wash and sleep, Evelyn stood on the back porch alone and looked up at the dark hill where the 2 graves were. The moon was bright enough that she could just make out the shapes of the headstones against the sky. She thought about her late husband, Thomas, who had died of a lung infection 4 years ago and left her a widow at 26. Thomas had been a good man, steady, kind, unambitious, in a way that she'd found either comforting or frustrating depending on the day. She'd grieved him properly. She'd waited the appropriate amount of time and then gotten up and gotten on with the business of living, because that was what you did. She was not heartbroken. She was not hoping for rescue. She was 30 years old, she was capable, and the only reason she was standing on a stranger's porch in the dark was because her father was about to lose everything he'd built, and she loved him too much to watch that happen. She heard the door behind her open and knew without turning that it was Roderick. He came to stand at the porch railing a few feet from her. He looked at the hill, too. "I buried them in the spring," he said without preamble. March of '85. The ground was still half frozen. "We had to work in shifts to get the holes deep enough." She waited. "Daniel was my younger brother by 6 years. Cora was his wife. They'd had the ranch east of the valley for 3 years, just starting to make something of it." He stopped. The fever moved through fast. By the time I knew how sick they were, it was already too late. Maisie was with me. They'd sent her to stay at the end of winter while Daniel fixed the barn roof. She never went back. She doesn't know how close it was, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. No, she will, eventually. I know, he paused. I just don't know how to tell her. I don't know how to do most of what she needs. She buttons her dress wrong, Evelyn said. A long pause, I know. You've known for how long? Since, he exhaled a while. You could have fixed it. She gets upset when I try to fuss with her clothes. I thought he stopped again. I thought it was better to let her be independent. It's not independence, Evelyn said, not unkindly. It's a 9-year-old girl who needs someone to button her dress and doesn't know how to ask for it. The silence stretched long enough to get uncomfortable, and then Roderick said, You noticed that in the first 5 minutes. I notice things, Evelyn said. It's not a skill. It's just paying attention. Another pause. The wind moved through the dark grass on the hillside. I'm not a man who does well with, he seemed to be looking for the word, uncertainty. I run this ranch by knowing what every piece of it is doing at every moment. I know my cattle, I know my land, I know my men. He looked at his hands on the railing. I don't know what I'm doing with that child, and it troubles me more than I know how to say. Evelyn turned to look at him. He didn't look back at her. Why me? She asked. There are women in the valley who'd accept this arrangement in a day. Women who want exactly what you're describing. Women who want the money, he said flatly. And you don't think I want the money? My father's debt's canceled, that's money. No, Roderick said. That's different. He finally looked at her. You came 40 miles alone to beg for your father. You asked me for nothing for yourself. Not once during that conversation did you mention your own situation, your own discomfort, your own anything. You came here for him. Evelyn looked away. He's my father. Most women your age have already moved on, built their own lives. You're riding 40 miles across the territory to carry his shame for him. Don't say it like that. It's the truth. It is, she said, but there's no need to make it uglier than it already is. He was quiet for a moment. Fair enough, he said. The wind came up again. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and knocked against the stall boards, a hollow, rhythmic sound that carried across the dark yard. I'll tell you my answer in the morning, Evelyn said, after the hill. All right. She turned to go inside, then stopped with her hand on the door. The girl. Maisie. What does she know about this? About any of it? Nothing yet. Does she like it here? Roderick's expression changed in a way Evelyn couldn't quite read. She was devastated when she came, he said. She cried for weeks. She's better now. But she's lonely. There aren't many children nearby, and he made a gesture that was more expressive than anything he'd said out loud. I'm not exactly a playmate, Evelyn almost smiled. No, she said. I don't suppose you are. She went inside. Roderick stayed on the porch a while longer, looking at the hill. In the morning, before the sun was fully up, they climbed the hill together. It was steeper than it looked from the house. The grass was long and dry at the end of the season, and it pulled at Evelyn's skirts as she walked. Roderick went ahead and reached back to offer his hand at the steepest part, without thinking about it, a reflex, not a gesture, and she took it without thinking about it either. They both let go at the top, neither acknowledging that it had happened. The graves were simple. Good stone, well carved, but plain. Daniel Blackthorn. Cora Blackthorn. The dates were close together, 2 days apart. Evelyn stood quietly and looked at them for a long time. Did they know each other long before they married? She asked. 3 years. Cora was from back east. Her family thought she was out of her mind, coming to Wyoming. A pause. She loved it. Said she felt like she could breathe out here in a way she never could back home. I understand that, Evelyn said. She and Maisie were. Roderick stopped. She was a good mother. The best kind. The kind who got dirty with her and didn't care. Maisie remembers her. Yes. Vividly. She talks about her sometimes, things Cora said. Things they did together, he paused. It's painful to listen to and wonderful at the same time. If that makes any sense. It makes perfect sense, Evelyn said. She looked at the stones a moment longer. Then she turned to face Roderick. I'll marry you, she said. He looked at her. You've decided. I decided about an hour ago, honestly. But I wanted to see this first. She looked back at the graves. A man who puts this kind of stone for his brother and his sister-in-law and keeps the ground tended when nobody's watching, that tells me something. What does it tell you? That you're loyal, Evelyn said simply, to people who can't do anything for you anymore. That's rarer than most people think. Roderick said nothing for a moment. Then I'll have the papers drawn up. I'll need to tell my father. How do you think he'll take it? Evelyn thought about the lines in her father's face, the shaking hands, the 2 in the morning footsteps. He'll argue, she said, and then he'll cry, and then he'll say yes because he loves me and he'll know I've already decided. She paused. He's going to feel guilty about it for the rest of his life. And you? She looked at him. I'm not doing this out of sacrifice, Mr. Blackthorn. I want you to understand that. I'm doing this because it's the best available option for people I love, and because she stopped, recalculated, and started again. And because I can manage a house, I can be a steady presence for a child. And I think I can be useful to you in ways you haven't considered yet. I believe you, Roderick said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it. They went back down the hill. In the kitchen, Maisie was eating breakfast with both elbows on the table, which Agnes was pretending not to see. She looked up when they came in and studied both their faces with the calculating attention of a child who has learned to read rooms by the expressions of the adults in them. Are you leaving today? She asked Evelyn. I need to go home and collect some things, Evelyn said. Maisie's face went carefully neutral, a child trying not to show disappointment. Oh, but I'll be back, Evelyn said, fairly soon. Maisie looked at her uncle. Roderick nodded once. Maisie looked back at Evelyn, and then the carefully neutral face cracked, just slightly, into something that might, given different circumstances, and another few minutes have turned into a smile. The rolls at the Clearwater Bakery, she said. If you're passing through, they're best in the morning. I know, Evelyn said. I'll see what I can do. She rode home through the long gold morning, and she didn't let herself think about all the ways this could go wrong until she was past the valley ridge and out of sight of the ranch. Then she let herself think about all of them. There were considerable numbers. Silas Hartwell was in the freight office when she arrived, hunched over his desk with the posture of a man trying to make himself smaller than his problems. He looked up when she came in, and something crossed his face, relief that she was back. And then something else, a father's specific radar, activating when he looked at his daughter and knew before she said a word that something had happened. Evelyn, he said carefully. Sit down, Papa, she said. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you say anything. He sat down. She told him. He argued. He cried just once, briefly, turning his face away and clearing his throat and coming back with his eyes red and his jaw set. Then he said she didn't have to do this, that he would find another way, that he'd sell the wagon horses first. That. Papa, she said gently. Stop, Evelyn, I've made my decision. It's done. I need you to let me do this. He looked at her for a long time, a father looking at his daughter and seeing all the ways he'd let her down and all the ways she was a better person than he deserved. Then he reached across the desk and took her hand. He'd better treat you right, Silas said. I believe he will, Evelyn said. He's not a cruel man, he's just limited, like most of us. And the girl? She's wonderful, Evelyn said, and realized she meant it completely. She needs someone, and I think I can be that someone. Silas held her hand and didn't say anything more. Outside the freight office windows, the valley went about its October business horses in the street, a wagon rolling toward the feed store, 2 women talking outside the dry goods shop and glancing at the Hartwell freight office, the way people in small towns glance at anything that might become interesting. None of them knew yet what was about to change. The wedding was quiet and fast, a judge in Clearwater, Agnes and one of the senior cowhands as witnesses. Maisie in her Sunday dress, buttons done correctly this time. Evelyn had helped her that morning, standing very straight and very serious, as if the solemnity of the occasion required her personal management. Afterward, Maisie pulled at Evelyn's sleeve. Are you Mrs. Blackthorn now? She asked. I am, Evelyn said. Maisie considered this. Can I call you something other than Mrs. Blackthorn? What would you like to call me? The girl looked at her for a moment, 9 years old, dark-eyed, working something out that she was too young to have the right words for, and too smart to pretend she didn't feel. I don't know yet, she said finally. That's all right, Evelyn said. We don't need to decide today. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon, the 3 of them side by side on the bench seat, the autumn hills rolling gold and brown around them. Maisie fell asleep against Evelyn's arm before they were halfway home. Evelyn didn't move. Roderick glanced over at the sleeping girl, and then at Evelyn, and then back at the road. Thank you, he said, low enough not to wake Maisie. Don't thank me yet, Evelyn said. I haven't done anything yet. He said nothing more. But he drove a little more carefully after that, navigating the ruts in the road with more attention than strictly necessary, as if the cargo had changed the calculus of the trip. which Evelyn supposed it had. The valley spread below them as the wagon crested the last ridge before home. It was enormous and quiet and golden in the October light, and it had no idea what was coming. Neither did any of them, really. That was the last peaceful afternoon any of them would have for a very long time. The gossip started before the ink was dry on the marriage papers. Evelyn heard the first version of it from Agnes, who reported these things the way a good housekeeper reported everything without editorial comment, in a flat voice that somehow made the content worse. A woman named Harriet Colby had told 3 people at the dry goods store that Roderick Blackthorn had purchased himself a beautiful wife by forgiving her father's debt, and that any man with that much money and that little sense deserved whatever he got. Agnes relayed this information while folding laundry and did not look up from the sheets. "I see," Evelyn said. "There's more," Agnes said. "Of course there is. Martha Ellison says you trapped him, that you rode out there knowing exactly what you were doing and you used your face to soften him up." Agnes put a pillowcase on the stack. "Martha Ellison has never in her life done anything requiring courage, so I'd take that into account." "I appreciate that, Agnes." "I'm not defending you," Agnes said briskly. "I'm providing context." Evelyn almost smiled. Agnes was not a woman who defended people. Agnes was a woman who managed situations, and she'd apparently decided that Evelyn was a situation worth managing, which was its own kind of endorsement. The gossip didn't surprise her. She'd known it was coming the moment she'd said yes on that hillside. A widow marrying a wealthy rancher 3 weeks after showing up to beg for her father's debt, the valley was going to talk. And it was going to keep talking, and there was nothing she could do about the talking itself. What she could do was decide how much of her energy she spent listening to it. She spent none. What she spent her energy on instead was the house, and Maisie, and learning the rhythm of Blackthorn Ranch, fast enough to be useful rather than decorative. The house was in better shape than she'd expected, which was Agnes's doing, but it had the particular emptiness of a place where a man lived alone, functional, clean, and stripped of everything that wasn't strictly necessary. No flowers on the table. No curtains that weren't purely practical. The front parlor had a piano in it that was slightly out of tune and covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested it had not been played in years. "Whose piano?" Evelyn asked Agnes on her second day. "Cora's. She played well." Agnes dusted a shelf without looking at her. "Nobody's touched it since." Evelyn didn't touch it either. Not yet. Some things needed time. She found her footing in the kitchen first, because the kitchen was territory she understood. Agnes was a capable cook, but stretched thin she ran the house largely alone, because Roderick had never seen the need for additional help, and Agnes had never asked for it, partly because asking for things wasn't in Agnes's nature, and partly because she'd developed a system that worked, barely, as long as nothing unexpected happened. The fall roundup was unexpected in the sense that it happened every year, at the same time, and Agnes had somehow been managing it alone for 3 years, which explained why the woman looked like she hadn't slept properly since 1884. "How many men?" Evelyn asked on the Monday morning when she woke to find Agnes already in the kitchen at 4:30, moving with the tight efficiency of someone trying to do 6 things in the space of 4. 22 right now. 2 more coming from the Henderson place to help with the north pasture push. 24 men, 3 meals a day, plus the cook wagon for the ones out on the range. Plus whatever they want at odd hours when they come in cold, Agnes said, which is always. Evelyn rolled up her sleeves. "Tell me what needs doing first." Agnes turned and looked at her. Really looked at her the kind of assessment that had nothing to do with how she looked, and everything to do with whether she was actually going to be useful or whether she was the kind of woman who rolled up her sleeves for. Show and then disappeared when the real work started. Whatever she saw, she apparently found acceptable. She handed Evelyn a wooden spoon and pointed at a pot. "Stir that and don't let it catch," Agnes said. "I'll start the bread." That was the beginning of it. By the end of the first week, Evelyn had taken over the cook wagon entirely. Agnes resisted for approximately 1 day, before conceding that having another competent person in charge of feeding 24 hungry men was not a threat to her authority, but a development she should have arranged 3 years ago. The cowhands were initially cautious around the new missus. Blackthorn in the way that men are cautious around a boss's wife when they're not sure of the rules yet polite, slightly stiff, careful about language. Evelyn fed them well and didn't comment on the language, and within 4 days they'd largely forgotten to be careful around her, which was exactly what she wanted. She learned their names fast. Not just their names, their preferences, their complaints. The ones who ate 3 portions and were still hungry, and the ones who barely touched their plates when the weather turned cold because the cold did something to their appetites. There was a young cowhand named Pete Garver, barely 17, who was on his first real roundup and trying so hard to look like he wasn't scared that it hurt to watch. There was an older hand named Croft, who had a bad knee that made the long days in the saddle brutal, and who ate standing up half the time because sitting down and then getting back up again cost him something. She didn't say anything about Pete's fear or Croft's knee. She just was sure Pete got an extra biscuit without being asked, and that Croft's coffee was always hot and ready before he had to ask for it. These were small things. But small things, done consistently, were how you told people that someone was actually paying attention. Roderick noticed. She knew he noticed because he was a man who noticed things and said nothing about them, a particular breed of observant that was almost more unnerving than someone who said everything, because you were never quite certain what had registered and what hadn't. He'd come to the cook wagon on the 4th evening to speak with his foreman, a rangy man named Bill Shaughnessy, who ran the roundup like a military operation and had approximately 0 tolerance for delays of any kind. She'd overheard them talking while she served out stew to the men coming off the late shift, and she'd caught Roderick looking at her twice, not the way she was used to men looking at her. That particular scan that landed somewhere around the face and the figure and drew its conclusions, but watching the way she moved through the camp, the efficiency of it, the way the men were relaxed around her. He looked away both times before she could catch him looking. On the 6th day of the roundup, everything went sideways. It started with the cook wagon's axle, which gave out on the ridge trail at 6 in the morning when the wagon was loaded with enough food to feed 24 men through a full workday. One wheel dropped into the rut, the axle cracked, and the whole rig tilted at an angle that sent a pot of cornmeal crashing off the shelf and put the coffee urn at serious risk. Evelyn climbed down, walked around the wagon, looked at the axle, and said a word she'd learned from a freight driver at her father's yard when she was 14 and had been carefully not using in polite company since. The cowhand driving the wagon, a young man named Torres, winced. "Can it be fixed?" Evelyn asked. "Not out here, not fast." "How long to get a replacement from the barn?" "Hour and a half, maybe 2. She thought about 24 men working cattle in the north pasture who were going to come in for their midday meal to find nothing. She thought about Bill Shaughnessy's face. She thought about the fact that the roundup schedule had no slack in it, that every delay cascaded. "Go get the axle," she told Torres. "Bring 2 men in the big wagon. I'll stay with the supplies." "Ma'am, you'd be out here alone." "I'm aware of that. Go," he went. She spent the 2 hours of waiting reorganizing what could be moved on horseback, calculating what the men actually needed against what could wait. And when Torres came back with the replacement axle and 2 ranch hands, she had a revised plan ready that got the midday meal to the north pasture only 40 minutes behind schedule instead of 2 hours. Bill Shaughnessy, when he got his coffee and his food, said nothing about the delay. He looked at Evelyn across the rim of his cup with the expression of a man revising an estimate upward. "You figured the axle problem," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Torres did the work," Evelyn said. "I just redirected the timeline. Torres tells it different." Shaughnessy drank his coffee. "Good meal, Mrs. Blackthorn." That evening, when Roderick came in from the pasture, one of the older hands, Croft, the one with the bad knee, stopped him before he reached the house. Evelyn was on the porch and heard the conversation without trying. "Your wife handled the axle situation today," Croft said. Kept her head, didn't panic. Roderick was quiet for a moment. "What axle situation?" "Ask her," Croft said, and walked away to the bunkhouse. Roderick came up the porch steps and looked at Evelyn. "Axle situation," he said. "Cook wagon, Ridge Trail. It broke this morning." She stood up from the porch chair. "It's sorted. Dinner's inside." "Croft doesn't say things like that about people." "Like what?" "He said you kept your head." "I did," she said simply. "It wasn't complicated. There was a problem. I assessed the options. I made a decision." "That's not a particularly exceptional thing." Roderick looked at her for a moment with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was recalibrating something he'd assumed. "It is, actually," he said. "More often than it should be." He went inside. Evelyn stood on the porch for a minute longer and looked out over the yard where the evening was settling into blue dusk. and she tried to decide how she felt about being married to a man who noticed the right things, but said them like they cost him something. She decided she didn't mind it. A man who said nothing at all would have been worse, and a man who said too much would have been exhausting. This was fine. This was workable. She went inside and got dinner on the table. The roundup finished on a Thursday, and by Friday the valley had gone back to its slower rhythm. And by Saturday, the gossip had moved on from the Axel incident which had made the rounds, because 24 men talked to a new development that Evelyn learned about from Maisie of all people. Maisie came home from a visit to a neighboring family's property, where she sometimes spent Saturday afternoons with a girl her age named Lucy Pratt, and she was quiet in the particular way that meant something had happened that she was deciding whether to report. Evelyn waited. She'd learned in the past 2 weeks that Maisie processed things on her own schedule, and that pushing before she was ready produced either silence or an explosion, depending on the day. She was helping Mathilde with her reading lesson. They'd established this as a daily practice. 40 minutes in the late afternoon at the kitchen table, when Maisie finally said, without looking up from her book, Lucy's mother said, "You married Uncle Roderick for the money." Evelyn kept her place in the book. "What did you say?" I said she was wrong. Maisie turned a page. "But I didn't know what the right answer was, so I didn't say that part." "The right answer," Evelyn said, "is that the reasons people get married are usually complicated, and people who say simple things about complicated situations are usually wrong." Maisie thought about this. "That's a grown-up answer." "It is." "What's the real answer?" Evelyn looked at her 9 years old, dark-eyed, already carrying the specific weight of a child who has learned that adults don't always tell the truth and isn't sure how to feel about it. "I married your uncle because your father's debts were going to take everything from him," Evelyn said. "That's true. And your uncle needed someone to help with you and with the house. That's also true. And those two true things came together at the same moment." She paused. "That's not the same as doing it for the money. Do you understand the difference?" Maisie considered. "One is selfish and one is practical?" "Something like that." "Lucy's mother is selfish," Maisie said with the particular certainty of a 9-year-old. "She wanted to buy the good flour from the mill last month and Mr. Dawson said it was already sold, and she was rude to him about it." "Well," Evelyn said carefully, "that's a separate matter." "I'm just providing context," Maisie said. Evelyn looked at her. "Agnes says that," Maisie said. "I'm practicing." Evelyn set the book down and laughed, a real one, the kind that came up without permission. Maisie looked startled, and then pleased, and then she laughed too, and for a minute they were just two people in a kitchen, finding something genuinely funny, which was, Evelyn thought, about as good as an afternoon could get. Roderick came in from the yard in the middle of the laughing and stopped in the doorway with his hat in his hand and an expression on his face, like a man who'd walked into a room and found the furniture arranged differently than he'd expected. Not bad differently, just differently. "What?" he said. "Maisie is providing context," Evelyn said. Maisie dissolved into fresh laughter. Roderick looked at his niece, laughing at the kitchen table, and something moved across his face that he turned away too quickly for Evelyn to see clearly. The first direct confrontation came in the 3rd week. His name was Warren Pratt, Lucy's father, Harriet Colby's brother-in-law, and a man who apparently felt that Roderick Blackthorn's business affairs were his personal concern. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon when Roderick was out with the North herd, and he came specifically because Roderick wasn't there. Evelyn knew this the moment she saw his horse at the gate, not the nervous energy of a man coming with legitimate business, but the deliberate timing of someone who'd chosen his moment. She met him in the yard. Warren Pratt was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s, with good clothes and bad manners, and he had the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously been wrong about anything in his own estimation. He looked at Evelyn the way he might look at new furniture, assessing value, considering whether it was worth what had been paid. "Mrs. Blackthorn," he said, and the slight pause before the name was a choice. "I was hoping to catch Roderick. He's with the herd. I can pass along a message. I think I'll wait. He won't be back until evening." She looked at him steadily. "What's the message, Mr. Pratt?" His eyes moved across her face, and then down, and then back up, and she kept her expression entirely neutral because she'd had decades of practice at this particular game, and she was significantly better at it than he was. "There's a concern," he said, among some of the families in the valley, about the arrangement. "Which arrangement?" "This." He gestured loosely in a way that encompassed her, the house, the whole situation. Roderick married fast. Nobody had a chance to well. The families that have known him for years feel they should have been consulted. Evelyn let a short silence pass before she spoke. Mr. Pratt, to your knowledge, has Roderick Blackthorn ever consulted the Valley's families about his business decisions? This isn't a business decision. It's his marriage, she said, which is between him and me. Are you suggesting that the families of the Valley have some governing authority over a private citizen's personal life? Pratt's face reddened slightly. I'm suggesting that a man of his standing has made his own choice, Evelyn said, as is his right. As is the right of any man or woman in this territory. She paused. Is there something specific you'd like me to pass along to him? Or were you planning to wait until evening after all? The redness in his face deepened. He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd come expecting to find a woman who could be managed with social pressure and had found something else entirely. You're very confident, he said, and the way he said it was meant to be a criticism. I've been managing things on my own for 4 years, Evelyn said. Confidence is a practical requirement. She held his gaze. Safe ride home, Mr. Pratt. He left. Agnes appeared from around the corner of the house. She had been there the entire time, which Evelyn had suspected. Mr. Pratt's sister-in-law is the one who started the money story, Agnes said. I know, he expected you to apologize for existing. I noticed that. Agnes went back inside. Evelyn turned and walked to the corral, where she stood at the fence for a few minutes, letting the residual irritation work its way out of her system. The horse named Copper Maisie's horse, the difficult one, was in the far corner, watching her, with his ears up and his head high. That particular posture horses take when they're deciding whether something is a threat. Don't look at me like that, Evelyn said to the horse. I'm not a threat. Copper flared his nostrils and didn't move. When Roderick came in that evening and she told him about Pratt's visit, he went still in the way she'd noticed. He went still when something made him angry, not an explosive stillness, but a very deliberate one, like a man physically choosing not to do the first thing that came to mind. What did you say to him? Roderick asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. That's more than I would have said. I wasn't rude. No, he said. You were worse than rude. You were right. He looked at her. Pratt doesn't know what to do with someone who doesn't need his approval. Few people do, Evelyn said. He stopped. Try it again. Does it bother you? The talking? She thought about lying, because the graceful answer was no. Then she thought about the fact that she'd already decided in the first week that this marriage would be better served by honesty than by social performance. It bothers me that my father hears it, she said. He's already carrying enough guilt. When he hears that people are saying, I sacrificed myself, which is how he reads it, even when he tries not to, it makes it worse for him. Roderick said nothing for a moment. Then, what can I do about that? Nothing, she said. The only answer to gossip is time and evidence. The talking will stop when people have enough evidence of the truth that the lie becomes boring. And what's the evidence we're building? She looked at him. That this is a functional household and a functional marriage and a child who is thriving. She paused. The rest takes care of itself, he nodded slowly. Then, after a moment, Pratt isn't going to let it go. I know. He'll come back. He has an idea about what this valley should look like, and we don't fit into it neatly, and men like him have trouble with things that don't fit neatly. Let him come back, Evelyn said. I'll be here. Something shifted in Roderick's expression, subtle, the way most things with him were subtle, and he looked at her for a moment. In that way she was coming to recognize as the precursor to something he wasn't going to say out loud, at least not yet. He said, Good night, Evelyn. Good night, she said. He went upstairs. She sat in the front room for a while, in the quiet, and thought about the fact that she had called this workable in the first week. And she was beginning to think it was more than that, which was not something she'd been prepared for and was not entirely sure what to do with. October turned to November. The valley contracted in the way it always did. When the cold came, people less inclined to make unnecessary trips. Social occasions fewer and closer, everyone hunkering down for the long work of getting through winter. Evelyn had always liked winter for this reason. The cold was clarifying. It stripped things down to essentials. Maisie had started calling her Evie. Not Mother. Not Mrs. Blackthorn. Evie, a name nobody else used, which Maisie had apparently decided was the exact right word for the particular thing Evelyn was to her. It had happened gradually, without announcement. First a tentative Evie one afternoon, when she wanted help with a button. Then again the next morning. And then it had just become the word. Established like a piece of furniture that had always been there. Evelyn did not say anything about it. She answered to it the way you answer to the name that fits you. Roderick heard it for the first time one evening at dinner when Maisie said, "Evie, can I have the bread?" And he looked up from his plate with that carefully maintained neutral expression, and then looked back down again and said nothing. Later, when Maisie was in bed, he came to where Evelyn was sitting with her mending in the front room, and he said, "She's never called anyone else that." "I know," Evelyn said. "Is it all right with you?" "Yes," she said. "It's more than all right." He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she could feel him working up to something he wasn't sure how to say, and she waited. "I don't know how to thank you for that," he said finally. "For what you've done for her. You don't need to thank me. She's a remarkable child." She was shutting down, he said. "Before. Getting quieter every week. I didn't know how to stop it." His voice was careful and measured, the way a person's voice gets when they're talking about something that costs them. "I could see it happening, and I didn't know what to do about it." Evelyn put down the mending. She was grieving, she said. She still is. But she's not alone in it anymore, and that changes everything. He looked at her. "Children can survive almost anything," Evelyn said, "if they have one person who shows up consistently. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be consistent. You learn that somewhere." She picked up the mending again. "My mother died when I was 11, she said. "My father raised me alone. He made 100 mistakes. But he showed up every single day. That's what I remember." The fire snapped in the grate. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard settled. "I didn't know that," Roderick said quietly. "You didn't ask," she said without heat. "No," he said. "I didn't." Another pause, longer this time. "Tell me something else," he said. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a category for yet, attentive, careful, the way you watch something you're afraid to startle. "I was engaged before Thomas," she said. "I was 20. He seemed suitable. My father liked him." She looked back at the mending. "He stole $300 from my father's business account and disappeared before we'd been engaged 4 months." The silence lasted a beat. "What happened to him?" Roderick asked. "I don't know," she said. "He went somewhere else and became someone else's problem, I assume." She ran the needle through the fabric. "I was angry for a long time. Then I met Thomas and I was less angry. And then Thomas died and I was just tired. And now?" She considered the question honestly. "Now I'm not tired anymore," she said. For the first time in quite a while. Roderick said nothing to that. But he didn't leave the doorway either, and she was aware of his presence there, the way you're aware of warmth on a cold night, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady and present. They sat in that quiet for a long while, the fire between them, and it was not uncomfortable. And then, at the very end of November, everything changed. The day the railroad man arrived, Evelyn was in the yard with Maisie, helping her practice the particular knot that you need to know when you're tying a horse's lead at a post. Maisie was concentrating with the ferocity she brought to all physical tasks, tongue between her teeth, brow furrowed, her small hands working the rope with more determination than precision. A rider came down the main road toward the ranch gate, and Evelyn looked up because she'd developed the habit of looking up when someone came down that road. And when she saw the rider's horse, a fine gray, too clean and too well appointed for local work, she felt her attention sharpen without quite knowing why. The rider came through the gate and dismounted, and he turned toward the house, and Evelyn saw his face. The rope dropped out of Maisie's hands. "Evie," Maisie said, "are you all right?" Evelyn was not all right. She was standing in the yard of Blackthorn Ranch in the last days of November 1887, looking at a man she had not seen in 9 years, and every nerve in her body had gone very still and very cold. Julian Mercer, older, better dressed. The particular grooming of a man who had been spending money he didn't earn on looking like a man who had always had it. He wore a dark coat with a railroad company pin on the lapel, and he was talking to one of the cowhands with the confident ease of someone who had practiced being charming until it became second nature. He hadn't seen her yet. "Evie." Maisie was tugging at her sleeve. "What's wrong?" Evelyn looked down at the girl. She made herself breathe. She made herself pick up the dropped rope and hand it back to Maisie, and she made herself say, in a voice that came out steadier than she'd expected, "Nothing's wrong. Finish the knot. I need to speak to someone inside." She walked toward the house at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, because she would not let him see her rush. She would not let him see anything yet. She needed to get inside, she needed to find Roderick, and she needed 30 seconds alone to decide what she was going to do about the fact that the man who had stolen from her father, destroyed her first engagement, and walked away without a backward glance, had just ridden up to her front gate wearing a railroad company pin. She got through the front door. She stood in the hallway and pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes. 9 years. 9 years, and Julian Mercer had come back to this valley. She opened her eyes. She stood up straight. She went to find her husband. Roderick was in the study when she found him, bent over a survey map with his reading glasses on. She'd only recently discovered he wore reading glasses. And he was clearly self-conscious about it, in the way that certain men were self-conscious about anything that suggested limitation. He looked up when she came in, and whatever was on her face made him take the glasses off immediately. "What happened?" he said. "There's a man outside. He just rode in." She kept her voice even. "His name is Julian Mercer. He's wearing a railroad company pin. And he is someone I know." Roderick set the glasses on the desk. "Know how? 9 years ago I was engaged to him." She watched Roderick go still. "He courted me for 4 months. He was charming and well-spoken, and my father liked him, which was the important thing, because my father's judgment about people was the one thing I trusted absolutely." She paused. "While we were engaged, Julian got close enough to the freight business to understand how the accounts worked. He took $300 from my father's operating fund and disappeared 2 weeks before the wedding." The silence in the study was very specific, not empty, but loaded. "Did your father report it?" Roderick asked. He tried. Julian had already moved on by the time anyone official started looking. He was good at being gone. She stopped at the window and looked out at the yard. She could see Julian Mercer still talking to the cowhand by the gate, comfortable and easy, one hand resting on his horse's neck. "He doesn't know I'm here. He hasn't seen me yet." "What does he want with the ranch?" "I don't know yet." "But the railroad pin." She turned from the window. "Nothing about Julian Mercer arriving in this valley wearing railroad authority is an accident. He finds situations that benefit him, and he inserts himself into them. That's what he does." Roderick stood. "I'll go talk to him. I want to be there." "Evelyn, I want to be there," she said again, and something in her voice closed the argument before it started. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. They went outside together. Julian Mercer had moved from the gate and was now standing in the center of the yard, turning slowly to take in the scope of the operation, with the particular appreciation of a man calculating what things are worth. He turned when he heard them come out, and his face opened into the smile she remembered, wide, warm, practiced to within an inch of its life. The smile held for a full second before his eyes found her face, and something flickered through them. Fast. Gone almost immediately. But she saw it. He hadn't known she was here. "Mr. Blackthorn," Julian said, extending his hand to Roderick with the ease of a man who'd shaken 10,000 hands and knew how to make each one feel like the most important. "Julian Mercer, Transcontinental Western Railroad. I appreciate you seeing me without notice. I know a man in your position has demands on his time." Roderick shook his hand. Said nothing. Julian's eyes moved to Evelyn. "And Mrs. Blackthorn." He was good enough to keep the surprise out of his voice almost entirely. "What a remarkable coincidence, is it?" Evelyn said. A brief pause. "The valley's smaller than I'd remembered." "Most places are," she said, "when you come back to them." Julian held her gaze for a moment, assessing, recalibrating, running the new information through whatever machinery operated behind that practiced face. Then he turned back to Roderick with the smooth pivot of a man who knows when to redirect. "I'd like to discuss an opportunity," Julian said. "The railroad is surveying a new line through this territory. The route we're considering would bring significant commerce to the region, freight capacity, market access, all the things that have historically been limitations for ranching operations this far from the rail network." "Which route?" Roderick said. Julian produced a folded map from inside his coat. He was good at the prop, always had been. Evelyn remembered the way he used to pull documents from his coat like a conjurer producing something that had definitely not been in his sleeve a moment ago. He spread the map on the hood of a nearby wagon. Roderick leaned over it. Evelyn moved to his side. She looked at the proposed line and felt the cold settle deeper into her chest. The route ran straight through the valley at the lowest elevation point, which was where the engineering made the most sense, and the construction costs would be the cheapest. It threaded between the larger ranches and cut directly across 5 or 6 smaller properties. And it ran, as cleanly as a surveyor's line could manage, straight across the lower slope of the hill behind Blackthorn Ranch, straight through Daniel and Cora's graves. She didn't say anything. She glanced at Roderick. His face had gone to stone. The route is preliminary, Julian said. There's significant flexibility in the final alignment. That's actually part of what I'm here to discuss. He straightened from the map. The railroad is looking to build goodwill with the established operations in this valley before the formal survey hearings begin. Ranchers of your standing, Mr. Blackthorn, your public support would go a long way toward ensuring the project moves through the territorial process smoothly. My public support, Roderick repeated. It would be meaningful. The smaller operations in the valley take their cues from Blackthorn Ranch. If you're seen as favorable to the project, that line goes through a cemetery, Roderick said. Julian blinked, then looked down at the map, and his expression did the careful thing of appearing to notice this for the first time. The survey team will work with landowners on. My brother and his wife are buried on that hill, Roderick said. My brother died 2 years ago. His daughter lives in my house. And you're telling me the railroad wants to cut through their graves to save money on the grade. The current alignment is preliminary, Julian said again, and Evelyn noticed that he said it in exactly the same tone the second time as the first no variance. No acknowledgement that the specific thing Roderick had said required a different kind of response. That was the tell. A man responding genuinely would have adjusted. Julian was executing a script. I'd like to show you something, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. She folded the map before Julian could stop her and handed it back to him. Come back tomorrow morning, she said to Julian. Roderick and I need to discuss this tonight. You'll have a full answer in the morning. Julian looked at her. She held his eyes without expression, and after a moment something moved in his face just slightly that was closer to wariness than anything else she'd seen there. Of course, he said. I'm staying at the Clearwater Inn. Tomorrow morning suits me fine. He folded the map into his coat, looked at Roderick. Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackthorn. A pause. Mrs. Blackthorn. He rode out. Roderick waited until Julian's horse was through the gate and moving down the road before he turned to Evelyn. His jaw was tight. She recognized the particular tightness of it by now contained fury, the kind he kept on a short leash. Tell me everything you know about him, Roderick said. They went inside. They talked until past midnight, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee between them and the fire burning low. Evelyn told him everything she remembered: the courtship, the theft, the way Julian had operated. Not just the events, but the mechanics underneath them, how he moved into situations sideways, presenting himself as a resource before revealing himself as a liability. How he made you feel chosen before you understood what being chosen actually cost. Roderick listened the way he listened to everything completely, without interrupting, his eyes on her face. When she was finished, he said, "He didn't know you were here." "No, that changes his position." "It complicates it," she said. "He'll recalibrate. That's what he does. He'll find the new angle." "What's the new angle?" She turned her cup in her hands. "The cemetery is a problem for him. He knew the line ran through someone's property. That's the whole reason he's here, to smooth that over. He probably expected a straightforward negotiation." She paused. "He didn't expect me. What does he know about your father? About the debt? When he left, my father was financially damaged but not destroyed. Julian took $300, which was significant but not catastrophic. The situation worsened afterward for unrelated reasons." She looked at Roderick. "But Julian is smart. If he's done his research on this valley, and he has, he always does. He knows Silas Hartwell's name. He may know about the debt, a beat. He may have already tried to find out how much leverage exists in this situation." Roderick looked at the table for a moment. "He could make a play for your father's remaining debts." "He could," she said, "if he found someone holding them. There's a note at the Clearwater Bank. Smaller amount. I didn't consolidate everything when I took on the main debt. I didn't know about it at the time." He stopped. "If Julian went looking for pressure points." "He would," she said. "He absolutely would." They looked at each other across the table. "We need to know what he's already done," Roderick said, "before tomorrow morning." "I need to get a letter to my father tonight," Evelyn said. "He needs to be warned, and I need him to start pulling together every document he has from the years Julian was around. Every ledger, every receipt, every record of the theft. Whatever my father saved. Will he have saved it?" "My father saves everything," she said. "He keeps records the way some men keep livestock more than necessary, organized by a system only he fully understands, but everything's there if you know how to look." Roderick stood. "I'll send Torres with the letter tonight. He's a fast rider. At this hour, Torres won't mind." He was already moving toward the door. "Write the letter. I'll have him saddled and ready in 20 minutes. She wrote the letter. She was precise about it, no hysteria, no performance. Just the facts her father needed to know, and a clear request for everything documented from the period of her engagement to Julian. She sealed it and gave it to Torres, who took it without complaint and rode out into the dark with the particular dedication of a young man who appreciated being trusted with something important. Evelyn went back to the kitchen and looked at the cold coffee and decided what she actually needed was sleep. She was halfway to the stairs when Roderick's voice stopped her. "I'm not going to support the railroad," he said. She turned. He was standing in the hallway, and in the low light he looked tired in a way he didn't usually show. "I know," she said. "Even before the cemetery. The route cuts across 3 of the smaller ranches in the South Valley. Henderson's, the Olaf family, the Garvers," he paused. "Pete Garver's family." She thought about Pete Garver, 17 years old, trying hard not to look scared on his first roundup. How many families total does this route affect? Directly? 7 or 8. Indirectly, he shook his head. More. The line splits grazing access from water access for the herds that move through the Middle Valley. That's every operation south of the ridge. Julian knows this, Evelyn said. Of course he does. The railroad knows exactly what it's doing. They want the cheap route, and they want it fast, and they want enough local support to get through the territorial hearings before anyone organizes against them. He looked at her. That's why he came to me. If Blackthorn Ranch endorses the project, the smaller operations follow. And then Julian gets his line. And the families who lose their grazing access have no one powerful enough to fight for them. No one, Roderick said. Not without me. She looked at him in the low light of the hallway. Then we know what we're doing, she said. He nodded. Get some sleep, she said. Julian will come in the morning trying to look reasonable. I'm not good at managing men like Julian. You don't have to be, Evelyn said. I am. Julian arrived at 9 the following morning, clean and pressed, and with the particular energy of a man who had spent the night adjusting his approach. Evelyn had expected this. She'd been up since 5. She met him on the porch alone. Roderick was inside, which she'd asked him to be. Julian would position himself differently with just her, and she wanted to see the new angle before Roderick came in. Mrs. Blackthorn. Julian came up the steps and stopped at the appropriate distance. Polite, calibrated. I hope I'm not too early. You're exactly on time, she said. Coffee? Please. She poured it. They sat in the front room, and Julian turned his cup in his hands. She remembered that gesture, the way he handled objects when he was composing himself, and began. I want to address the cemetery issue directly, he said. I understand why that was alarming, and I want you to know that the railroad has full flexibility on that specific section of the alignment. The hill can be avoided. It adds cost, but the company is prepared to absorb that in the interest of good relations with Blackthorn Ranch. And the families in the South Valley? Evelyn said. A brief pause. Those conversations are ongoing, which means they haven't agreed, which means the process is in early stages. Julian. She used his first name deliberately and watched him process the deliberateness of it. I know how you work. I've had 9 years to think about it, which is more than enough time to understand the full shape of something I only partly saw at the time. She held his gaze. You came here to neutralize the most powerful voice in the valley, so that the smaller operations would have nowhere to turn when the railroad moves against them. You'd protect Blackthorn Ranch from the route, get Roderick's public endorsement, and let the smaller ranches fight alone against a done deal. Julian's expression didn't crack, but something behind it went very careful. That's a dramatic interpretation, he said. Is it inaccurate? A long pause. He changed approaches, which she'd expected. The direct flattery version. You were always the smartest person in the room, he said, and he said it with the tone that used to work on her warm, inclusive, the particular intimacy of being recognized. I always knew that, even then, don't, she said. Evelyn, don't, she said again. We're past that. Tell me what you actually want. He set down the coffee cup. When he looked up, the performance had dialed back slightly, not gone, but reduced to a lower setting. The railroad needs this route, he said. The alternative adds 40 miles and 6 months of construction. The company will not absorb that cost voluntarily. Then the company will have to go through a territorial hearing. They'll win the hearing. Maybe, Evelyn said, but they'll win it with the valley fighting them, which is a different kind of winning than getting it done quietly. And the families who lose their access will have legal grounds to contest the route for years. That costs the railroad more than the 40 miles. Julian studied her. What do you want? I want the railroad to reroute the line north of the Valley Ridge. That's not feasible. I want the families in this valley to be represented at the territorial hearing by an attorney of their choosing, paid for by this ranch. She said it without having discussed it with Roderick, and then noted internally that she was going to need to tell him about that part. And I want your name on a document acknowledging the debt structure of the original Hartwell freight account. There it was. She watched him process it. I don't know what you think you have, he said carefully. I think I have my father's ledgers from 1,878 to 1,881, she said. And I think when a trained eye looks at those ledgers, they'll find the precise mechanism by which $300 moved from the Hartwell operating fund to a private account. And I think that account will have your name connected to it, even at this distance of years. She paused. I may be wrong about the documents. We'll see. Julian said nothing. Or, Evelyn said, you can tell me I'm wrong, and we can both wait for my father's records to arrive and find out together. The silence lasted a long time. Julian looked at his hands. Then he looked up at her, and for just a moment the performance was fully gone, and what was underneath it wasn't evil exactly. It was something smaller and more ordinary than evil. It was a man who had spent his life finding angles, because straight lines had always seemed too slow. You wouldn't have the authority to offer those terms, he said. This is your husband's ranch. The door from the hallway opened. Roderick came in and sat in the chair to Evelyn's left. He'd been listening from the hall, which she'd counted on. The terms my wife described, Roderick said, are exactly what I'd have said if I were better at saying things like that. He looked at Julian. She speaks for this ranch. Julian looked at Roderick, then at Evelyn, then back at Roderick with the expression of a man updating a calculation he'd made several days ago and finding it was wrong in a way that mattered. I need to consult with the company, Julian said. You have 3 days, Evelyn said. After that, we go to the territorial representatives ourselves. Julian left. When the horse was through the gate, Roderick turned to look at Evelyn. I speak for this ranch, she said before he could. You do, he said. Since when has that been a question? She looked at him. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said the things he meant, which was the same way he said everything else, which was why she was beginning to trust it completely. There's something else, she said. The attorney. I heard. We don't have to, he said. We do. The Hendersons and the Garvers and the Olafs can't afford representation at a territorial hearing. If the railroad runs this through, they lose. He paused. I have the money and I have the standing. It's not complicated. It's not inexpensive, she said. No, he admitted. But it's right. She looked at him for a moment, this man she'd married for practical reasons, in a ceremony that had lasted 20 minutes, who wore reading glasses he was embarrassed about, and couldn't button a child's dress, and said the important things like they cost him money, and who had just, without hesitation, agreed to spend his own resources fighting a railroad to protect families, who had spent months whispering that he'd purchased himself a beautiful wife. We need the Valley ranchers, she said. All of them. Not just the ones directly affected, all of them. If Julian can pick them off one by one, he will. They won't all come. Some of them won't, she agreed, but enough will. If they understand what the route actually means for water and grazing access, even the ranches the line doesn't touch directly will see the threat. She was already working through it. I want to host a gathering here. Let me cook for them. Let me sit them down in one room and let Roderick. She stopped. Let you lay it out plainly. The route, the access implications. What it means in 5 years if the railroad cuts the valley the way they're proposing. Roderick absorbed this. You want to open this ranch? Yes. To people who've been saying, I know what they've been saying, she said. And I don't care. Their opinions of me are not the relevant thing right now. Their land is. She looked at him steadily. Will you do it? He thought for a moment. Just a moment. When? He said. End of the week. Before Julian comes back with the company's answer. We need to be organized before then. Word went out the next morning. Roderick sent his cowhands to every ranch in the valley with an invitation, not a request, not a suggestion, but the kind of direct invitation from a man of Roderick's standing that was difficult to decline without a reason. Most said yes. The Pratts said they'd consider it, which meant no, and Evelyn struck them from the list and moved on. 4 families sent immediate confirmations, and by Thursday afternoon they knew they'd have at least 11 households represented at Friday's gathering. The day before the gathering, Julian came back. He didn't come to the ranch. He went instead to the Clearwater Bank, and Evelyn only knew about it because Torres, running an errand in town, saw him go in and came back to tell her. She sent Torres back to town with a specific question for the bank manager, a man named Hollis Drummond, who had known Silas Hartwell for 20 years, and who owed the Hartwell Freight Company a personal kindness from some years past. The question was, had any inquiries been made regarding outstanding notes on the Hartwell Freight accounts? Torres came back with the answer by evening. Julian inquired about exactly that, and a note existed smaller than the original debt Roderick had consolidated, a remaining balance at a different institution, and Julian had asked about the process for purchasing that note from its current holder. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and held Torres's verbal report in her mind and felt the cold, familiar shape of Julian's strategy click into place. He couldn't move against Roderick directly. Roderick was too established, too well regarded, and now too clearly committed to fighting the railroad route. So Julian was moving sideways the way he always moved. He would purchase Silas Hartwell's remaining debt, and then he would deliver the message, support the railroad, or watch your father lose the last of what he'd built, she told Roderick that evening. He sat at the kitchen table and listened, and when she finished he was quiet for long enough that she counted 12 seconds of it. He's not going after the ranch, Roderick said. He's going after your father. Yes, because he knows you'll fold before you'll watch Silas lose everything. He thinks I'll fold, she said. Roderick looked at her. Will you? She thought about her father's hand shaking over the ledger, the 2 in the morning footsteps, the red eyes he'd turned away from her in the freight office the day she told him about the marriage. I need to call him first, she said. My father. He needs to know before I decide anything. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have right now. Roderick accepted that. He didn't push, which she was grateful for, because she wasn't sure what she would have done if he'd pushed. Silas's response came back with Torres the next morning, a letter in her father's angular hand, written on freight office stationery, 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph told her he'd found the ledgers she'd asked for. The second told her what he remembered about the debt structure from the period of her engagement. The third paragraph was short. It read, Do not sacrifice the valley for me, Evelyn. I have already cost you too much. Whatever you decide, I will survive it. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and kept it there through the rest of the day, through the preparations for the gathering, through the cooking that consumed all of Friday morning. She cooked the way she cooked under pressure, fast and focused, her hands moving through tasks while her mind worked the problem from every angle it could find. There was a path through this. There had to be. Julian was counting on her choosing between her father and the valley, and if she accepted those as the only 2 options, she'd already lost. The families started arriving at noon. 11 households, men and women both, because Evelyn had specifically asked for both, and because the invitation had come from Mrs. Blackthorn as much as from Roderick. She set long tables in the main room and the front parlor. She fed them well. She watched the room warm up the way rooms do when food is good and the fire is high, and people feel that someone has genuinely made space for them, rather than performing hospitality for a purpose. Warren Pratt was not there. His brother-in-law, a quieter man named Gerald, was. Bill Shaughnessy, Roderick's foreman, sat at the head of one table and said very little and listened to everything. Old Croft was there with his wife, a small, precise woman named Margaret who asked 3 of the sharpest questions in the room. When the meal was clearing and the coffee was out, Roderick stood. He wasn't a natural speaker. Evelyn had come to understand this about him. He was authoritative in person, one-on-one, in the specific language of ranching and cattle and land. Standing in a room full of people waiting for him to lead them somewhere was different, and she saw him feel the difference. But he told them the truth. He unfolded Julian's map on the cleared table and pointed at the route and explained, in plain language, exactly what it meant: the cemetery on the hill, the grazing access, the families whose land was directly crossed, and the families whose herds would be cut off from water. He said the railroad wanted his endorsement, and he had refused it. He said he was prepared to fund legal representation for every affected family at the territorial hearing. He said, I'm not asking you to fight a railroad. I'm asking you to show up at a hearing and tell the truth about what this route does to this valley. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then Gerald Pratt, Warren Pratt's quiet brother-in-law, said, What are our chances? Better than Julian Mercer wants you to think, Evelyn said. Every head in the room turned to her. she hadn't planned to speak. But the question was honest and deserved an honest answer, and the honest answer required things she knew that Roderick didn't. Julian Mercer is working a specific strategy, she said. He wants this done quietly, before the Valley has time to organize, because a coordinated opposition at a territorial hearing is expensive for the railroad to fight. He needs enough local goodwill to make the project look reasonable. Without that, the company faces a contested hearing that could delay the route by years. She looked around the room. The moment we walk into that hearing as a unified valley, not one ranch, not three, but every family in this room, his strategy falls apart. Margaret Croft, the small, precise woman, leaned forward. You know this man. I did, Evelyn said, a long time ago. A pause. Then why, Margaret said, is he still operating? It was not a hostile question. It was the kind of question an intelligent woman asks when she wants to understand the shape of the problem. Because he moves fast and he moves sideways, Evelyn said. He finds people who are isolated, and he offers them something before they understand what he's taking. He's been doing it long enough that he's very good at it. She held the older woman's gaze. But he's never run into an entire valley that knew he was coming. The room shifted. She could feel it, not dramatic, not sudden, but the particular shift that happens when people who were cautious start to lean forward. Henderson from the South Valley, whose property the route crossed directly, said, "What do we do?" "Come to the hearing," Evelyn said. "Bring your records. Bring your surveys. Bring your deed filings and your water rights documents and every piece of paper that establishes what you own and what you access." She paused. "And before the hearing, don't talk to Julian Mercer alone. Anyone he approaches, you bring someone else into that conversation. He's less effective when he can't isolate." The meeting went another hour. By the time the families started riding home in the dark, 11 households had agreed to attend the territorial hearing together. A show of unity that, 3 weeks ago, would have seemed impossible for a valley that had spent the autumns whispering about Roderick Blackthorn's pretty new wife. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the last wagon roll out through the gate. Roderick came to stand beside her. "You told them things I didn't know," he said. "About Julian?" "Yes." "You were calm doing it. I was terrified doing it," she said. "I just don't look terrified." "That's different." He was quiet a moment. The night was very cold and very clear, and the stars over the valley were the particular hard brightness of winter stars, the kind that give light without warmth. "He's going to buy your father's note," Roderick said, "assuming he hasn't already." "I know. What do we do about that?" She took a breath. The cold air went all the way down. "My father's ledgers are on their way here," she said. "Torres picked them up this afternoon. My father sent them with the morning freight run." She turned to look at Roderick. "If what I remember is right, if the documentation is there, Julian's debt claim doesn't hold. Because the original money came from a theft. You can't legally collect a debt that originated in your own fraudulent act. Not even if you purchased the note at arm's length." Roderick looked at her. "You'd need to prove that in front of the territorial authority." "Yes. And if the documents aren't there? If your father's records don't show what you think they show?" She looked at the dark hill behind the house, where Daniel and Cora's graves were invisible in the night. "Then we figure out what's actually there," she said, "and we work with that." He didn't press further. Inside, in the kitchen, the last of the fire was burning down, and in the hallway Evelyn could hear the small specific sound of Maisie's footsteps. The child had been put to bed 2 hours ago and had clearly not stayed there. "Maisie," Roderick said without raising his voice. The footsteps stopped. "Bed," he said, a pause. Then footsteps retreating upstairs. Evelyn looked at him. "She does that every time there are people in the house," he said. "She doesn't want to miss anything." "She's going to miss tomorrow too," Evelyn said. "I need to go through those ledgers tonight. I'll help." "You don't have to." "I know I don't," he said. They went inside. Agnes had left coffee on the stove. Agnes always left coffee on the stove, which was one of the things Evelyn had come to regard as one of the more reliable kindnesses in her life, and they sat at the kitchen table with the box of her father's ledgers between them and started reading. The handwriting was Silas Hartwell's, cramped and angular and absolutely precise. The handwriting of a man who trusted numbers the way other men trusted instinct. Evelyn had grown up watching her father record things. Every transaction, every movement of money, every debt paid and owed, noted in a hand so consistent it looked almost printed. She found the first record inside 20 minutes. It was a withdrawals column, October 1878, and beside a specific line, $43, marked as supplies, someone had written a second notation in different ink, smaller, added later. The notation was a set of initials and a date. JM returned partial. She turned 3 pages, found another, and another. By 1 in the morning, they had 11 entries that suggested a pattern. Not proof, not yet. Not the way a territorial court would require proof. But a pattern that a trained eye, a lawyer's eye, an accountant's eye, could follow from notation to notation until it arrived somewhere specific. Julian Mercer had not simply taken money. He had borrowed it, in small amounts, against anticipated business dealings that he had described to Silas in enough detail that Silas had noted them as legitimate. And he had returned partial amounts, just enough to maintain the appearance of good faith, while the overall sum extracted continued to grow. It wasn't crude theft. It was a long, patient fraud, conducted by a man who understood that small, consistent acts of apparent honesty were the best camouflage for a larger dishonest purpose. Roderick looked at the entries she'd marked and was quiet for a long time. "How much does he know you have?" he said at last. "He knows my father kept records," she said. "He may have assumed time and circumstance had made them incomplete." She looked at the ledger. "He may have underestimated my father's thoroughness." "Most people do," Roderick said. She looked at him. "Most people underestimate you both," he said, and it came out without any particular inflection, just a statement he'd arrived at and was reporting. She looked back at the ledger so he wouldn't see her face do the thing it was doing. Outside, the wind had picked up a winter wind, coming down from the north with serious intent. It found every gap in the old house and moved through them with the low sound of something that was not going to stop. Inside the kitchen, the coffee was cold, and the fire was ash, and the ledgers were spread across the table between them. And somewhere in those pages was the shape of a way through this that Evelyn couldn't see completely yet, but could feel the outline of the way you feel the edge of something in the dark before you can name what it is. She turned the next page. She kept reading. The ledgers stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days. Evelyn went through every page, twice once for the overall pattern, once for the specific notations that could be independently corroborated. She made a separate record of each entry she flagged, copying the relevant details onto clean paper in her own handwriting, organizing them chronologically so that the shape of Julian's fraud was visible at a glance rather than buried in 4 years of otherwise routine bookkeeping. Roderick watched this process with the specific attention he gave to things he was learning from rather than things he already understood. He didn't pretend to follow the accounting logic as quickly as she did, and he didn't pretend otherwise, which she appreciated. When she explained something, he listened. When he saw something she'd missed, a notation she'd passed over, a date discrepancy, he said so, without making it a larger thing than it was. By the 3rd morning, they had what she thought was enough, not a certainty. She wasn't a lawyer, and the ledgers were a private business record rather than a formal legal document, and any attorney worth consulting would immediately point out 3 or 4 ways Julian's representation could challenge the entries. But the pattern was there, and patterns had a way of becoming convincing when they were presented to people who already knew something was wrong. She'd written to an attorney in the territorial capital, a man named Samuel Hatch, whom Roderick knew slightly, and whose reputation for land and contract law was solid. She sent the letter with Torres on the 3rd morning, and got a response back in 2 days. Hatch would come to Clearwater for an initial consultation before the hearing. Julian, meanwhile, was not idle. He had purchased Silas Hartwell's remaining note. They found out through Agnes, who found out through the network of information that moved through a frontier valley, the way water moves through cracked ground by roots that weren't visible on any map, but were nonetheless completely reliable. A merchant in Clearwater had heard it from the bank's junior clerk. The junior clerk had told his wife. His wife had told the woman who helped with the laundry at the inn where Julian was staying. That woman's sister worked 2 days a week at Blackthorn Ranch. Agnes delivered the information to Evelyn over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with the same tone she used for everything. He paid full value for it, Agnes said. Didn't try to negotiate it down. He didn't want a negotiation, Evelyn said. He wanted it fast and he wanted it clean. No loose ends that could be untangled later. She set down her coffee. How much is the note? $240. Not catastrophic. Not trivial either, not for Silas Hartwell in his current position. But it wasn't the amount that mattered, it was what Julian intended to do with the ownership of it. She expected him to come to the ranch. Instead, he went to her father. She found out about that from Silas himself, who sent a letter that arrived Thursday, 4 days before the territorial hearing. Silas's handwriting was steadier than she'd expected, and the letter was shorter than most of his correspondence. He told her what Julian had said, that the note would be called in immediately if Evelyn and Roderick continued to oppose the railroad route. That Silas had until the day of the hearing to convince his daughter to stand down. That Julian had framed it, Silas wrote, as doing her a favor, giving her a way to protect her father without having to admit she'd backed down. The last line of the letter read, "I told him to get out of my freight yard. I wanted you to know that before anything else." Evelyn read the letter standing in the kitchen, and then she folded it very carefully and put it in the pocket of her apron. The first letter, the one where her father had told her not to sacrifice the valley for him, and she stood there for a moment with both hands pressed flat against the apron fabric. Agnes, who was at the stove and whose peripheral vision was extraordinary, said nothing. After a moment, Evelyn took her hands away from her apron and went to find Roderick. He was in the barn with his foreman, going over preparations for moving the remaining cattle to the winter pasture. He saw her face when she came in and said something brief to Shaughnessy, who took the immediate social intelligence of a man who had worked for Roderick Blackthorn for 9 years and walked to the far end of the barn to find something to do there. She handed Roderick the letter. He read it. He handed it back. His jaw was doing the thing. "He went to your father directly," Roderick said. "Yes, your father told him no. Yes, and now Julian has no more angles," he said. "Either we fold before the hearing or we don't." "We don't," she said. "Evelyn, your father's $240. I know what my father's $240 means," she said. "And I know what my father's letter means. He doesn't want me to fold." She held Roderick's eyes. "And I'm not going to. But I need you to hear me say it plainly, because if this goes wrong, if the hearing doesn't go our way, if the documents aren't enough, if the judge is already in the railroad's pocket, my father loses his yard. I know that. And you're still with me. I was with you before you asked," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. There was always this moment with him where he said something that landed so directly, it took her a second to absorb it. "All right," she said. "Samuel Hatch arrives tomorrow. We go through the ledgers with him, and we find out what we actually have." Samuel Hatch was a narrow man in his 50s, with the kind of dry intelligence that showed up in his eyes before it showed up anywhere else. He arrived on Friday afternoon, traveled from the territorial capital in a hired wagon, because he didn't ride horses if he could avoid it, and was in Evelyn's kitchen with the ledgers spread before him inside 30 minutes of arriving. He went through the entries she'd flagged without speaking. He turned pages forward and back, cross-referencing, making small pencil marks in the margins of his own notebook. He asked 2 questions, both factual and specific. He was quiet for a long time. "Tell me," he said at last, "who knew about these notations when they were made?" "My father made them himself," Evelyn said. "He's the only one who kept the books." "Is he willing to testify to that?" "He is." Hatch tapped his pencil on the notebook. "The entries themselves are in 2 different hands," he said. "The original transaction records are your father's. The secondary notations, these JM references, are in a different hand. Smaller, different ink. I noticed that. Do you know whose hand it is?" She'd been thinking about that for 3 days. "I believe it's Julian Mercer's own handwriting," she said. "He kept parallel records. He noted the amounts and partial returns in my father's ledger as a kind of private accounting, keeping track of what he'd taken and what he'd returned so he didn't lose count." Hatch looked at her over his glasses. "That would be remarkably careless of him. He was 24 years old, and he thought my father would never look closely enough to notice," she said. "He wasn't careless. He was arrogant." Hatch looked back at the ledger. "Do you have anything with his handwriting from the period? A letter, a document he signed? Anything contemporary?" She'd thought about that, too. "We have the railroad survey proposal he presented to my husband. He signed the covering letter. That's 9 years later. Handwriting changes. I know. But it's something." Hatch closed his notebook. "Here is what you have," he said, in the tone of a man who was going to be honest, because being honest was the most efficient path to a workable strategy. "You have a pattern of entries that suggests a systematic extraction of funds from your father's business, attributed by notation to a set of initials consistent with your former fiancé's name. You have your father's testimony about the circumstances. You have a 9-year-old railroad document for handwriting comparison." He paused. "What you do not have is direct proof A formal fraud prosecution would require more than this. Evelyn had expected this. But the territorial hearing isn't a fraud prosecution, she said. No, Hatch said. It isn't. The hearing is about whether the railroad's route should be approved, she said. For that, I need to establish two things. First, that the route causes documented harm to Valley families, which we can demonstrate clearly. And second, that the note Julian purchased on my father's debt originated from fraudulent activity, which affects whether it can be used as legitimate financial leverage in the context of a public hearing. Hatch looked at her for a long moment. You've thought about this carefully. I've had several sleepless nights, she said. The second argument is difficult, he said. The note itself is clean. Julian purchased it legitimately from the bank. The fraud, if it exists, is upstream of the note. But if we can demonstrate that the original debt structure was distorted by Julian's fraud, that my father owed more than he should have, because Julian's theft damaged the business than the amount Julian is now. Holding as leverage is itself a product of that fraud. Hatch was quiet. It's not airtight, she said. I know that. No, he said. But it doesn't have to be airtight. It has to be credible enough that the territorial judge looks at Julian Mercer's financial dealings with this valley and decides he's not someone whose project deserves expedited approval. She paused. The railroad can still get its hearing, but it'll be a real one, with real scrutiny, and the route question will be decided on the merits of the objections rather than on the strength of Julian's goodwill campaign. Hatch looked at Roderick, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table. Your wife, Hatch said, should have been a lawyer. She should have been a great many things, Roderick said, and there was something in how he said it that Hatch noticed, and that Evelyn noticed Hatch notice, and that she elected not to examine too closely at present because there was a hearing in 3 days, and she needed to stay focused. What do we need to prepare? She asked Hatch. He opened his notebook again. They worked until midnight. The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday in the Clearwater Courthouse, a building that was still new enough that the wood smell hadn't fully settled into the walls. It held perhaps 60 people, if they were willing to be uncomfortable about it.
And by the time Evelyn arrived with Roderick and Hatch at 8:30 in the morning, there were already 40 people inside.
And more coming through the door. She'd expected the Valley families. She had not quite expected the number of people who had come from the surrounding area and neighboring valleys, the small settlement at Wicklow Creek, 2 ranchers from north of the ridge who'd heard about the hearing through channels she couldn't fully trace. Word had moved in the 2 weeks since the gathering at Blackthorn Ranch, and it had moved further than she'd planned. The judge was a territorial appointee named Clarence Webb, a heavy-set man in his 60s, with a reputation for patience and a specific dislike of procedural games. Hatch knew him slightly and had told her Webb would let both sides speak fully. He would not be rushed, and he would not be impressed by financial influence if the evidence pointed somewhere else. He had also, in a long career, developed a particular sensitivity to situations where a powerful outside interest was trying to move faster than the local process could track. Julian arrived with 2 railroad attorneys. They were well-dressed and carried leather cases full of documents, and had the confident efficiency of men who did this for a living, and had done it successfully enough times that they considered the outcome largely predetermined. Evelyn watched them set up at their table and felt the familiar cold settle in her chest and told it firmly to wait. Julian saw her. He inclined his head a small controlled acknowledgement. She returned it. Neither of them smiled. The hearing opened at 9. The railroad presented first. One of Julian's attorneys laid out the route proposal with the practiced fluency of someone who had presented the same structure in 6 territories and expected it to land the same way here. Economic development, freight capacity, market access for Wyoming ranching operations that had historically been isolated from rail networks, projected revenue increases for the valley. The presentation was polished and specific and entirely absent of any mention of what the route would cost the people sitting in the room. Judge Webb listened without expression. When the presentation concluded, Webb said, Mr. Mercer, the route crosses property currently used as a registered family cemetery. What is the railroad's plan for that? Julian stood. The railroad is prepared to work with the affected landowner on a sensitive relocations. The graves are registered under the Homestead and Property Act of 1879, Hatch said from his seat. The registration predates the railroad survey by 6 years. Relocation requires the written consent of surviving family members and a separate territorial review. That process takes a minimum of 14 months. Webb looked at Hatch. You're representing the landowner? I'm representing the Valley families as a collective, Your Honor. Roderick Blackthorn and his neighbors. Go ahead, Webb said. Hatch stood. He was not a dramatic speaker. He was methodical and precise, and he built his argument the way a careful man builds a fence post by post, each one set before the next is started. He presented the route map and the survey boundaries. He showed, with specific reference to existing deed filings and water rights registrations, exactly how the proposed line would function as a barrier between grazing land and water access for 7 separate operations in the South Valley. He called Henderson to testify, and Henderson spoke plainly about what the route meant for the movement of his cattle. He called Old Croft, whose bad knee made getting to the stand slow and painful, and whose testimony was consequently all the more credible for the obvious discomfort it cost him. Margaret Croft, the small, precise woman, had brought her own documents a survey she'd commissioned 3 years ago that established the water access patterns for the Middle Valley ranches. She had not been asked to bring it. She had simply brought it with the initiative of someone who had looked at the problem and figured out what was needed. Evelyn had to press her lips together when Margaret produced the survey. The railroad attorneys objected twice. Webb overruled both objections with the same short word. At noon, Webb called a recess. Evelyn stepped outside with Roderick and Hatch, and the cold air hit her like a reminder that she was still a person with a body that needed oxygen. How are we doing? Roderick asked Hatch. The root objections are strong, Hatch said. The cemetery issue alone may be enough to force a resurvey. The grazing access argument is solid. He paused. The Mercer financial question is the variable. When do you raise it? Evelyn asked. When we reconvene. I want to establish the fraud argument as a separate matter from the root objections. The root objections stand on their own. The Mercer issue is about the conduct of the railroad's representative. Can you get the note into evidence? I can reference it. Julian's purchase of your father's debt while simultaneously acting as the railroad's official representative in this valley is itself a conflict of interest. He looked at her. That might be enough, independent of the fraud documents. It might not be, she said. No, he agreed, it might not be. They went back inside. When the hearing reconvened, Hatch raised the financial question directly. He laid out Julian's purchase of the Hartwell note in plain terms, the timing, the amount, the relationship between that purchase and Julian's official role as railroad representative. He described it as a conflict of interest that called into question the integrity of the railroad's local dealings. Julian's attorneys objected immediately, loudly, and at length. Webb listened to all of it and then looked at Julian. Mr. Mercer, he said, you purchased a private debt from a local citizen while serving as the railroad's official representative in this valley. The two matters are entirely separate, Julian said. He was composed. The note was a private financial decision. The citizen whose debt you purchased is the father of the wife of the man whose endorsement you were seeking for the railroad project. A brief pause. That is coincidental. A great deal about your dealings in this valley appears to be coincidental, Webb said, with a dryness that was not quite judicial neutrality. Let's look at the documents. Hatch introduced the ledgers. He did it carefully, not as proof of criminal fraud, which he'd told Evelyn would be overreaching, but as documentation of the financial history that connected Julian Mercer to the Hartwell going back 9 years. He explained the notation pattern. He showed the entries. He noted the difference in handwriting between the primary records and the secondary notations, and submitted the railroad survey letter for comparison. Julian's attorneys objected to the ledger entries as irrelevant to the current proceeding. These entries go to the character and conduct of the railroad's representative in this valley, Hatch said. They go to whether the financial arrangements, Mr. Mercer has made with local citizens represent legitimate business dealings or an attempt to create leverage against people opposing his employer's project. Webb looked at the ledgers. He looked at them for a long time. Mr. Mercer, he said, do you wish to respond to the suggestion that these notations reflect your handwriting? Julian stood. He was still composed. She had to grant him that whatever he felt, the surface held. The entries are ambiguous, he said. My initials are not unusual. The suggestion that I kept parallel records in a private citizen's ledger is, did you have access to the Hartwell Freight Business's accounting records during the period of your engagement to Miss Hartwell? Webb asked. A pause, short but there, some access, Julian said. as a prospective family member. And when the engagement ended, were there financial disputes between you and the Hartwell family? Another pause. Longer. There were misunderstandings, Julian said. Something moved through the room, not a sound, not a movement, but a collective shift in the quality of attention. The people sitting in that courthouse had known Silas Hartwell for years. They knew his freight yard. They knew the period when his business had begun struggling. A woman in the second row, Evelyn recognized her as the wife of one of the Wicklow Creek ranchers, leaned slightly toward her husband and said something in a low voice. He nodded. Evelyn looked at Julian's face and saw, for the first time that morning, something that was not quite composure. Your Honor, Hatch said. The railroad's route objections, the cemetery registration issue, and the conflict of interest represented by Mr. Mercer's financial dealings in this valley are each individually sufficient to warrant a full resurvey and a contested hearing process before any route approval is considered. We are asking the court to refer the current proposal back to the survey stage, to require independent review of the financial relationships between the railroad's local representative and valley citizens, and to stay any debt collection actions by Mr. Mercer pending that review. Webb looked at the railroad attorneys. Gentlemen, they conferred in low voices. Then the senior attorney stood. The railroad respectfully requests a 30-day continuance to review the objections and consult with the company leadership regarding the survey. Webb looked at him for a moment. The request for continuance is granted, he said. The debt collection stay is also granted pending review. He looked at his papers. The court notes significant questions regarding the conduct of the railroad's representative in this valley, and is referring those questions to the Territorial Attorney General's office for independent evaluation. Julian's face, when she looked at it, had gone very still. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his expression. The actual stillness of a man who had just understood that the particular game he'd been playing had ended, and not in his favor. Webb struck the desk and stood, and the room exhaled. Afterward, outside the courthouse, in the cold November air, with the sky pressing low and gray above the valley, something's happened that Evelyn had not expected and had not prepared for. The ranchers came to her. Not to Roderick, though they spoke to him too, but to her specifically. Henderson came first, his hat in his hands, and he said, Mrs. Blackthorn, I owe you a straight apology. Some of what's been said in this valley about you and your reasons for coming here, I should have shut that down sooner. She looked at him. He was a big man, red-faced from the cold and from something else, and he was holding his hat like it was an anchor. It wasn't your responsibility, she said. No, he said, but it was in my power and I didn't use it. I'm sorry for that. He put his hat back on and stepped aside, and Gerald Pratt, Warren Pratt's quiet brother-in-law, was behind him. Gerald Pratt said less. He said only, thank you, and shook her hand, and stepped aside. Margaret Croft waited until most of the others had moved on. The small, precise woman looked at Evelyn with those sharp eyes and said, that man, Mercer, you knew what he was going to do before he did it. I knew how he thinks, Evelyn said. Where did you learn that? From being fooled by him the first time, Evelyn said. And then from 10 years of being angry about it. Margaret studied her. Anger well spent, she said finally, and walked back to where old Croft was waiting, moving slowly on his bad knee. Evelyn stood in the cold for a moment. The courthouse door opened and closed behind people leaving. A wagon moved down the main street. Somewhere a horse shook its head and blew hard against the cold. Roderick came to stand beside her. He was looking at the street too. They're taking their hats off to you, he said, low enough for just her. Some of them, she said. Most of them. She didn't say anything to that. What Julian did this morning when Webb asked him about the financial disputes, Roderick said. He hesitated, yes. That was the moment, yes, she said. That was the moment everyone in the room understood that there was something to hesitate about. Roderick was quiet for a beat. You put him in that position. Hatch put him in that position. Hatch had the documents because you spent 3 nights going through your father's ledgers. He paused. Hatch had the argument because you built it. She looked at the street. You're not going to take the credit for this, are you? He said. It was not quite a question. The credit isn't what matters. Evelyn. What? He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were standing outside a courthouse in Clearwater, Wyoming, in November of 1887, with cold in the air, and a fight not quite finished, but tipped in a direction it hadn't been tipped before. and Roderick Blackthorn was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized in the way you recognize something you've been looking for without knowing you were looking. "I want to say something," he said. "All right." He stopped. Started again. "I want to say it right, and I'm not," he exhaled. "I'm not a man who says things well. You know that. You say things fine," she said. "You just say fewer of them than most people. What I want to say is," he stopped again, looked away at the street, and then back at her. "When I proposed this arrangement, in October, I was thinking about Maisie, about the ranch, about practical things." He paused. "I want you to know that's not the full picture. Not anymore." She waited. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something I read somewhere," he said, and there was something so uncharacteristically helpless in his voice that she almost reached for him right there on the street. "Try," she said. "I think—" He stopped. "I think I stopped seeing the arrangement sometime around the cook wagon axle incident," he said. "And I started seeing you." He said it the way he said the things he meant, plain, with no decoration, and consequently impossible to dismiss. "And I don't know what to do with that except to tell you." The street went on being the street. The cold went on being cold. "You picked a public location for this," she said. Something moved in his face. Relief, maybe, that she was responding with humor rather than silence. "I didn't plan it," he said. "I was going to later. At home." "All right," she said. "Tell me the rest of it at home." "There's more?" "You said you wanted to say something," she said. "You've said the beginning of it." He looked at her for a moment. "You are extremely difficult to have a conversation with." "I know," she said. "You married me anyway." She turned and walked toward where Torres had the wagon waiting. After a moment, she heard Roderick follow, and the particular sound of his footsteps behind her on the frozen ground was something she was going to remember for a long time. They didn't speak about it on the ride home. Maisie was at a neighboring family's house for the day, and the ranch was quiet when they arrived, which was unusual and gave the afternoon a particular quality, the specific silence of a house that was normally occupied by a 9-year-old. Agnes had left a pot on the stove. Agnes always left a pot on the stove. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and thought about everything that needed to happen next. Hatch's follow-up with the Territorial Attorney General's office, the letter she needed to write to her father about the stay on the debt collection, the question of what Julian would do now that his leverage had been removed and his conduct was under review. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. She heard Roderick's footsteps in the hallway. He appeared in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and his hat in his hand. "You said, tell you the rest at home," he said. "I did. Do you want to hear it?" She turned from the stove and looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I want to hear it." He came into the kitchen and sat at the table, not at the head of it, where he usually sat, but closer to the middle, which was somehow significant in a way she couldn't have articulated precisely. He put his hat on the table and looked at it for a moment. "I know this isn't what you planned," he said. "I know you came to me in October because you had no other good options and I offered you one. I'm not asking you to pretend that's different than what it was." He looked up. "But I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is—" He stopped. "Ask," she said. "Is this—" He made a small gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the house, the ranch, all of it. "Is this a place you want to be? Not because you have to. Not because it's the best available arrangement." He looked at her steadily. "Because you want to." She thought about the hill with the graves and the wind in the dry grass. She thought about Maisie saying Evie for the first time, like it was a word she'd been waiting for. She thought about 3 nights at this kitchen table with cold coffee and her father's ledgers and Roderick's reading glasses on the edge of the table between them. She thought about what it meant to have a person next to you who paid attention to the right things. "Yes," she said, "it is." He held her gaze. "That's enough for me," he said. "For now. I'm not asking for more than that." "I know you're not," she said. She moved to the table and sat across from him. Outside, the wind moved through the valley with the low sound of something settling in for winter. "My father's going to be all right," she said. "Yes. The stay on the debt collection, Hatch will handle it. And when the Attorney General's office finishes with Julian's dealings, the note will likely be voided entirely." He paused. "Either way, your father's yard is safe." She nodded. "Are you tired?" he asked. "Extraordinarily," she said. "Then stop," he said. "For tonight. It'll all still be there tomorrow." She looked at him. "You're telling me to stop working." "I'm suggesting it," he said. "Because you have been running at a pace that would exhaust most men I know, and you've been doing it without complaint, And at some point, the body collects what the mind won't give it voluntarily. That's almost a speech, she said. Don't push it, he said. She almost laughed. She was too tired to actually laugh, but it almost happened, and he saw it, and she saw him see it, and something between them settled into a different shape, not new exactly, but more defined than it had been this morning. The pot on the stove simmered. The house held the warmth of a fire Agnes had laid before she left for the evening. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table across from her husband and let herself stop, just for a moment, running the next problem through her mind. Just for a moment, she let the house be quiet and the evening be ordinary, and that be enough. It was more than enough. It was in fact quite a lot. Julian Mercer left the valley on a Thursday. Nobody saw him go. That was typical of him, arriving with ceremony, departing without it, the particular vanishing act of a man who understood that exits were best managed before anyone could organize a response to them. The inn at Clearwater reported that he'd paid his bill the night before and ridden out before dawn, leaving no forwarding address and no message for anyone. Evelyn heard about it from Torres, who heard it from the merchant whose wife had the laundry connection to the inn, which was still the most reliable information network in the valley. She received the news on a Friday morning while she was helping Maisie with arithmetic at the kitchen table, and she sat with it for a moment before returning her attention to the problem in front of them. 7 times 8, she said. 56, Maisie said. Is something wrong? Nothing's wrong, Evelyn said. 7 times 9, 63. Maisie put her pencil down. You made a face. I was thinking about something. What? That some problems resolve themselves when you stop giving them room to grow, Evelyn said. 7 times 10. Maisie picked up her pencil. 70, she said. That's not really an answer. It's the best one I have right now, Evelyn said. Julian's departure didn't mean the work was finished. She understood that clearly enough. The Territorial Attorney General's office had begun its review of his financial dealings in the valley. Samuel Hatch was managing the documentation process, which required Silas Hartwell's ledgers to be formally submitted as evidence and required Silas himself to provide a sworn statement regarding the period of his engagement to Julian. The railroad's route proposal had been sent back to the survey stage, which in practical terms meant it would take at minimum 2 years before the company could bring a new alignment to a territorial hearing, and by that time the political circumstances would be different enough that the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The note Julian had purchased on Silas's debt was voided 4 weeks after the hearing, on the grounds that it had been acquired in circumstances constituting a conflict of interest by a party under active investigation for financial misconduct. Hatch sent Evelyn the formal notification in a letter that was 1 paragraph long and entirely free of celebration, which was exactly how Hatch communicated everything, and which she found appropriate. She sent her father a separate letter that was also not long. It said, "The note is gone. The yard is yours. Don't argue with me about it." Silas's response came back within the week. It said, "I'm not arguing. I'm grateful. Come home for Christmas if you can manage it." She showed the letter to Roderick. He read it and handed it back and said, "We'll go for a week." "That's not," she stopped. "You'd leave the ranch for a week." "Shaughnessy runs this place better than I do when I'm looking over his shoulder," he said. "It's Christmas," your father asked. She looked at him. There were moments, still, when he did something that required her to completely rearrange her understanding of who he was, and this was one of them. "All right," she said, "and bring the ledgers back when we come," he said. "They belong in your father's office." The Attorney General's office released its findings in February. The report confirmed what the ledger entries had suggested. Julian Mercer had a documented history of financial misconduct that predated his railroad employment and had continued in various forms through his current professional dealings. The specific fraud against the Hartwell freight business, while too old for criminal prosecution under the applicable statutes, was formally acknowledged in the report as the probable origin of the debt structure that Julian had later attempted to leverage. The railroad, facing the prospect of a representative whose conduct had been officially documented as problematic, terminated Julian's employment. They sent a formal letter to Roderick's attorney expressing regret for any inconvenience caused by their representative's actions in the valley, which was the corporate version of saying as little as possible while appearing to say something, and which Hatch filed away without comment. Whether Julian faced further consequences in another territory under different circumstances, Evelyn never learned. He was the kind of man who found new towns and new angles and new people who hadn't been warned, and she suspected he continued in some version of his particular pattern for years. That bothered her in the specific way that unresolved things bother people who are honest with themselves. She would have preferred a clean ending for him, some definitive accountability that closed the question permanently. But the world was not organized around her preferences, and Julian Mercer was not her problem anymore. He was somewhere else's problem, and that someone else would have to manage him with whatever tools they had available. She had other things to attend to. Spring came late that year, a hard March that kept the ground frozen into April and made the calving season more difficult than anyone wanted. Evelyn spent 3 nights in the barn during the worst of it, alongside Roderick and 2 of the hands, and came inside on the 4th morning, covered in things she'd rather not describe, and too tired to care about any of it. Maisie, who had been told to stay in bed, was of course not in bed. She was at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, with her dark eyes wide. "How many?" she asked. 11 calves, Evelyn said, all of them breathing. Maisie let out a breath. "Copper was worried," she said. He kept pacing. "Copper is a horse," Roderick said, coming in behind Evelyn. He was cold. "He was worried," Maisie said firmly. Roderick looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Roderick. "Go back to bed," Roderick said to Maisie. "It's almost morning. Go back to bed anyway." Maisie went, but with the particular gait of someone who considers themselves to have won the moral argument, even in retreat. Evelyn watched her go and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a precise word for, something between relief and fullness, the specific weight of a life that had more in it than she'd expected. She went to wash. Roderick made coffee, which was still 6 months into their marriage, something he only did when he thought the occasion warranted it, which meant she understood it as a form of communication. They sat at the kitchen table, with the early light beginning at the windows, both of them exhausted and not bothering to hide it. 11, he said. 11, she agreed. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The house was quiet except for the fire. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his cup. "In October," he said, "when you came to the ranch the first time, I told myself I was making a practical offer, a transaction." He turned the cup in his hands. She recognized the gesture now, the thing he did when he was organizing something he didn't know how to say. "I told myself that for about 3 weeks. And then," she said, "and then you told me my niece wasn't being independent. She just didn't know how to ask for help." He looked up, and I sat with that for a long time. Because it was true and I'd missed it. And I'd missed it because I was looking at the surface of things instead of what was underneath them. He paused. "You look at what's underneath things. You've always done that." She waited. "I want to cancel the arrangement," he said. Her heart stopped for exactly 1 second. Then he continued. "The original terms. I don't want a wife who's here because I forgave a debt. I don't want a transaction." He held her gaze. "I want you to stay because you want to be here, not because of what I gave your father. Because of," he stopped, "because this is where you belong. If you feel that. If you don't, I want you to tell me." The kitchen was very quiet. "Roderick," she said. "I know I'm not." He made a short gesture. "Easy. I know I don't say things the right way. I know you spent the first month figuring out how to manage a man who doesn't know how to be managed." "I wasn't managing you," she said. "You were," he said. "A little," she almost smiled. "A little," she admitted. "I fell in love with you," he said. "Somewhere between the axle and the courthouse. Probably the axle, if I'm honest." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plain, without embellishment, the way you state a fact you've verified and are confident about. "I don't know what you feel. But I thought you should know what I feel, because you deserve to know." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning light. This man who wore reading glasses he was embarrassed about and couldn't give a speech to save his life and had agreed, without hesitation, to spend his money fighting a railroad for people who'd spent months talking badly about his wife. And she thought about all the ways she had not expected any of this when she'd ridden 40 miles in October with a borrowed dress and a practice speech she hadn't needed. "The arrangement ended for me a long time ago," she said. He looked at her. "I don't know exactly when," she said honestly. "I'm not someone who tracks those things precisely. But it was before the courthouse. Well before." "How long before?" She thought about it. "The night you told me about Daniel and Cora," she said, "on the porch. You said it was painful to listen to Maisie talk about her mother and wonderful at the same time." She paused. "That was the moment I understood what kind of man you were." He was quiet. "You're not easy," she said. "You're right about that. But easy isn't what I needed. She looked at him steadily. I needed someone who shows up. Every day. Even when it's cold and nothing is working and the calves won't come and everything costs more than it should. She paused. You show up. He reached across the table. Not dramatically, just his hand, palm up, on the table between them. She put her hand in his. They sat like that while the coffee cooled, and the morning came fully through the windows, and the ranch woke up around them with all its ordinary noise and weight and life. The following spring, the spring of 1889, Evelyn and Roderick and Maisie and Silas Hartwell climbed the hill behind Blackthorn Ranch together. Silas had come for Easter and stayed 2 weeks because Maisie had asked him to teach her to play checkers, and he had discovered that she was both a quick learner and a ruthless opponent, and these two qualities combined meant he couldn't stop playing her. He was thinner than Evelyn remembered from childhood, and slower on hills, but the shaking in his hands had eased since the debt was cleared, and he laughed more than he had in years. The four of them stood at Daniel and Cora's graves in the late April afternoon, and the wildflowers had come in around their headstones, not planted. Just there, the way wildflowers arrive in places that have been left in peace long enough. Maisie crouched down and touched one of the flowers without picking it. She was 10 now, growing into her face in a way that suggested the woman coming was going to be someone worth knowing. She would have liked the flowers, Maisie said. She didn't say who. She didn't need to. She would have named all of them, Roderick said. She knew every plant in the territory. It drove your father crazy because she stopped to look at them when they were supposed to be somewhere. Maisie looked up. He didn't really mind. No, Roderick said. He didn't really mind. Silas stood to one side with his hat in his hands, looking at the stones with an expression that had nothing in it but honesty. An old man looking at the places where young people had been set down before their time, and letting that be as heavy as it was. Evelyn stood beside her father and felt the weight of the hill and the afternoon and the year that had passed, all of it at once. She thought about the woman she'd been in October, frightened under the practicality, carrying shame that didn't belong to her, riding toward a stranger's ranch with a borrowed dress and a careful speech, and no real certainty about anything. She thought about what you find out about yourself when you're pushed past the things you prepared for. She had not known, before October, that she was capable of building something from a bad starting point. She had not known she could cook for 24 men in a breaking wagon on a ridge trail and make it work. She had not known she could stand in a courthouse and feel genuinely afraid and do the thing anyway. She had not known that a 9-year-old girl saying a nickname, her nickname, a word that had always belonged to someone closer than she'd ever been, to anyone could feel like something she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. You think you know the shape of your own life. You think you know what you're capable of, and what you need and where the edges are. And then something happens, not a good thing. Not at first, just a hard thing. A corner you didn't choose to turn, and you find out that the shape was larger than you thought. That there was more room in you than you knew. That the things you believed were your limitations were actually just the places you hadn't been tested yet. She did not believe that suffering was necessary or that difficulty was a gift. She believed it was hard and real, and that it cost people things they couldn't always get back. Her father's shaking hands. The 2 graves and the spring flowers. Maisie crying for weeks in a house where no one knew how to help her. Those were real costs. She didn't romanticize them. But she also had come to believe, slowly, through a winter of evidence that what you do inside the hard thing matters more than the hard thing itself. That you can carry shame that doesn't belong to you and still put it down. That a practical arrangement can become the truest thing in your life if you're honest enough to let it. That a child who has lost everything can still find someone to hold on to if that someone shows up consistently enough. These are not lessons she would have chosen to learn this way. But she'd learned them, and they were hers, and she wasn't giving them back. Ready to go down? Roderick said beside her. She looked at him. He was watching her with that particular attention, the one that had frightened her a little at first, because she hadn't been used to being seen clearly by someone who said nothing about what they saw. She was used to it now. She'd stopped being frightened of it sometime around February, when she'd understood that his seeing her clearly was not a threat, but the opposite of one. Yes, she said. Maisie took Silas's hand to help him down the steep part, which was ostensibly for his benefit, and was also, Evelyn knew, because Maisie liked holding his hand and had learned to construct reasons to do it. Silas knew this too, and accepted it with the dignity of a grandfather who understands that some transactions are worth more than their stated value. They went down the hill together, the four of them, into the late afternoon, with the valley spread before them and the ranch below, and the whole long Wyoming sky overhead doing what it always did going on past every edge you could find. Enormous and indifferent, and somehow, in spite of everything, exactly what was needed. At the bottom of the hill, Maisie looked back up at the stones and then at Evelyn. "Will you come back up with me next year?" she asked. "Yes," Evelyn said, "every year." Maisie nodded, satisfied, and turned toward the house. Evelyn looked at the hill one more time. The graves, the wildflowers, the particular quality of late afternoon light on pale stone. She had arrived in this valley, carrying her father's shame and someone else's verdict about what she was worth. She had put both of those things down. What she had picked up instead, Maisie's trust, her father's relief, Roderick's plain and steady love, her own clear understanding of what she was capable of. None of it showed in a mirror. None of it was the kind of thing that got you called beautiful by strangers at a market, or made a room go quiet when you walked in. But it was hers. It was real. And it had turned out to weigh considerably more than everything she'd arrived with. She turned from the hill and walked toward home.